It's so great to be here with neighbors. I know it's already dark outside, even though it's so early, and it's nice to be cozy and be in this intimate setting with all of you. For so many years, LGBTQ allyship has been a neighbor right here in the South End, and so have had the pleasure over many years of being in organizing space with you all, and it's really an honor to be asked to speak with you tonight. And it's interesting. I'm in DC, actually, joining you from DC right now. I'm at a conference where legislators from all over the country have assembled after our midterm elections. And all of us are talking about the realities of this moment. And I know you all know in your personal lives, in your professional lives, in your activism, we have a lot to talk about right now. And I just have to start by acknowledging, you know, all of us are here. We've all been doing the work. We've all been steadfast. But speaking for myself, I'm tired. You know, I'm a little bit tired. We've been in some form of continual crisis as a community in a really acute way because of COVID for the last 3 years. But the reality is, for many of us who are LGBTQ, Black, Brown, Indigenous, or person with disabilities, young people or elders, we often find ourselves in spaces and places where we have to defend, or we have to speak up, or we have to take a stand. And it's nice to have spaces like this where you get to come as you are and just be. And so even though it's been a really long day, I feel really energized to be here with you all today. I want to start by talking a bit about what I've been talking with my colleagues from all over the country about the last few days, which is about really the political moment at this time and how the political moment in this time has been shaped by our movements and communities. I have been in activism circles for 25 years. Luana and I actually started a lot of our work. When I first met Luana was when I was beginning my journey in understanding and deepening my work in reproductive justice. That was really my entry point into a whole spectrum and world of activism. And I'm a very proud abolitionist. I'm a Black queer woman. I'm the first Black queer woman to ever be elected into the Washington State Legislature, and I'm the only abolitionist serving in our state. But really, my entry into abolition came from reproductive justice. When I was in reproductive justice circles, I had the honor of sitting with many early on when conversations of reproductive justice were coming to Washington State. We had a private donor in Washington, a private family foundation. They wanted to fund reproductive justice work. And when we went to the meeting to show them all that the communities had told us, I remember sitting at that table and the donors looking at us and saying, "We're really disappointed to see so much of this is about housing and parenting. And we think this is not the right direction. So we're not going to continue to fund this work." And I always remember that because everything that those donors said to us was the opposite of what community had said to us. And the thing that I appreciate about LGBTQI allyship and so many that you partner with is that you also are folks who go to community first. And that's something I took that lesson from that. If we had started by talking to the donors and following their lead about where our priorities should be, we would have gone in a completely different direction from where our neighbors needed us to be. But what we all decided was, funding be damned, we're going to continue the work. And so several of us continued to work together, and that work led to Surge Reproductive Justice being formed. That work then continued for 10 years of us building up that little organization. There were many meetings we had with allyship in that work over many years, sitting at many tables, gathering up neighbors, lobbying together, making sure decision makers heard from us. And that work ultimately led to a lot of policy wins that actually fed me into the abolitionist movement. And one of those was shackling. In Washington State, up until 10 years ago, we still shackled incarcerated people when they were giving birth. When people ask why I'm an abolitionist, I always start with a conversation about the fact that I'm an abolitionist because I believe in an end to slavery. And in that, the legacy of abolition is a 4-century-long struggle to end slavery in this country. And the reason I always give that context is because slavery is still alive and well in this country because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment, despite the Emancipation Proclamation. And the legacies of slavery are still apparent everywhere in our communities. And that issue of people being shackled while they were doing the most human thing of bringing life into the world is a literal legacy of slavery happening right then in that moment in Washington state. But I want to say this about abolition work. Abolition work has always been work of allyship. The abolition movement had always been a movement where queer people, straight people, Black people, white people came together towards a common cause. What I love about this organization, the work you all do, is you understand how important it is for us to come together, because the systems that are before us would have us be apart all the time. In fact, they've built everything so that we're apart, so that we think we're isolated and that our circumstances and the systems that we're in, that we're alone wandering through that. But spaces like allyship and other spaces have brought us together. And that's why I'm so excited to have been in movements like the reproductive justice and abolition movement, where people from all walks of life have come together over and over again to say, we need this for our community, or we need you not to do this because it harms our communities. And so with me and my colleagues here, we've been having a lot of conversations about the realities of where we are, what it means for our neighbors to have been in continual crisis, and what it is to sort of have a moment of breathing a little freer. I know I've been in more spaces where I'm starting to feel a little more comfortable deciding when I wear my mask or not. But we have to also acknowledge that our communities, and particularly our marginalized communities, have been the hardest hit by everything that's happened right now. And what we're also seeing is that while we saw some really beautiful wins, I know I was not alone in being ecstatic that Warnock won his seat in Georgia and what that cements at the federal level. And certainly we live in a state that has a lot of wind at our back when we think about who's representing us and the issues that will be the salient issues that we work on. We have to also face the realities that there's a lot of rhetoric and harm and hate speech and hate actions happening all around us. And regretfully, Seattle and Washington state are not exemptions to that. Too many people are finding themselves having conversations about tearing back all of the wins that we've had over the last 15 years that have really been cemented around allyship and people asking for the most basic recognition in human rights. This today, on the federal level, they passed the first equity in marriage bill that we've had at the federal level, cementing and bookending 10 years ago when Washington state was one of the first states to say same-sex couples can be married. When I think about that as someone who is of mixed heritage and mixed race, my parents got married and I was born in 1979. But the context of that is that their marriage, a Black man and white woman being married, they could not move freely around the United States as an interracial couple until 10 years before I was born. Only 10 years in 1969 did that law happen. And so we have to pay very careful attention to what's happening and why it's happening and where it's happening. And we have to not only continue to fortify the protections we have now, but think also about how we're going to be expanding those rights. And when I think about those things, I'm really concentrating right now on our elders and our young people. There's a lot of conversations right now about whether trans children can be in sports, in a community with their peers, with the gender identity that they are living in and that they're experiencing. And the fact that their folks are pushing back on that is something we have to pay attention to. And certainly at the local level, where in Seattle public schools, we have some protections, but certainly around Washington state, there's a lot of conversations that are quite sobering around those realities. And I really appreciated what you brought up earlier, Luana, about the crisis of housing, because still too often our particularly queer elders are finding themselves having huge gaps in their ability to age in place and stay in the communities that they have built and helped make thrive for so long. And regretfully, I'm seeing that happen far too quickly in South Seattle. I've seen many elders being displaced and having to move, despite the South End being the place that they built up, where queer and straight and Black and white folks have lived together and built community, not only around activism, but around schools and around meals and around faith communities. I want elders here. I want my children to grow up with the activists and elders who made our community as vibrant and wonderful as it is when we joined it. And so the fact that you all are continuing to concentrate on those issues make sure people come together, and make sure that we're moving forward together. I can't thank you enough. But we need to think about what we're going to do, not only on one-on-one interpersonal levels, but systemically. And so I want to share a little bit with you about a fight that I had going through the legislature in the last legislative cycle. So as I shared with you, I was one of several founding board members of Surge Reproductive Justice. And I had a full circle moment this last legislative session when Surge and a number of stakeholders who they'd partnered with approached me and asked if I would sponsor the Doulas for All bill. So for folks who don't know, doulas are birth care workers who are non-medical workers. So they're separate from the doctor who might be with you when you're birthing, but they are there specifically to support the folks giving birth, to make sure that those birth outcomes, that the advocacy that birthing folks have, they have everything they need to have the type of birth that they want and deserve. And for Washington State, there's been a push for the last 10 years to have doulas recognized with a huge priority on Black, brown, and queer doulas. And I need to note that it's particularly the LGBTQIA community that's had a really big focus on doula birth services, especially for those who may not identify as women, but find themselves in birthing circumstances, who too often need advocacy to have the birth outcomes that they deserve. So when they approached me, I was really excited about the possibilities. And we very, very carefully crafted that bill to make sure that the language was fully inclusive of all people, all birthing people. And we were very careful with that language so that there would be no exclusion. And that's really important because too often our reproductive justice and rights bills have had very prescriptive women-specific language that's really isolated and separated our communities instead of embracing everyone who needs those services. And even in Washington State, we have a lot of work to reverse a lot of that language so that our services can continue to be more inclusive and that systems like insurance and others continue to catch up with the realities of our families and communities. When we introduced the bill, we knew that there was going to be a lot of pushback about that language, and we were very, very strategic about making sure there was a huge groundswell of community present in testimony. For folks here, we had almost all of our legislative sessions remotely, which was very challenging in a lot of ways. But in one way, it was wonderful, is that we saw a 600% increase at the state legislative level about how much community testimony and engagement we had with legislation, which was transformative in our ability to say to our other colleagues, see, your constituents and neighbors want this too. So we had fought for the bill, we'd gotten it through committee, and then we found when we were bringing it to the floor, several Republican colleagues had put women language attached to the bill. We sat in coalition, we sat in community, we'd been meeting with stakeholders and community members and doulas and birth workers every week as the bill was moving, really rooted in community as we were moving the bill. And we really had to sit and deliberate, what are we going to do? Are we going to double down and doubly strengthen the inclusive language? Are we going to accept this amendment? What's going to happen? We knew if we accepted the amendment, it would sail through the vote in the House. And not only would it pass, it would pass with bipartisan support. But what we were really clear on is we were not willing to leave any community member behind to do that. So what we did was very strategic. We talked to colleagues in the Senate. And I was very happy that I got to partner with Emily Randall, also a queer Latina Chicana. And what we said is, we're like, listen, we're going to talk to the chair. We're going to go ahead and accept this language. But while we say that, we're going to give 5 dissenting arguments about why this language should not be in the bill. But as soon as it gets to the Senate, we need you to take all of that language out. And she was like, I am more than happy to remove all of that language. And so what we ended up with was a bill that passed the House. It had bipartisan support out of the House. And the minute it hit the Senate committee, the very first thing they did within 72 hours of it reaching the Senate was remove all of that language that was exclusionary and return it to the original draft of the bill. And they passed it out of committee the same day. That was very intentional. And it was very much us making sure that the policy that was very well drafted was also dealing with the political realities of what we had in the legislature. And then we made sure that it was on the floor within a week so that no other amendments could be added to it. And even though they tried to add that amendment back, we were able to pass that bill with not one period changed in the bill by the end of the day. And I say that because too often I've been at tables when we're talking about policy, and folks have told us that political expediency is why we have to exclude people. And I am here to tell you, we do not have to leave anyone behind. And I know it because I fought it and I did it in the legislature. We passed that bill from introduction to passing in one legislative cycle without leaving anyone behind. And I'm ecstatic to tell you that now 52% of births in Washington state that are paid under Medicaid will now have the option to have a paid doula standing beside that person giving birth. This is literally going to save lives. This is literally going to mean that trans parents have someone there advocating for them when they can't advocate for themselves when they're in the most, involved medical moment of their life. And it also means that we have paved the way with this bill to show other states and other communities that it can also happen this way. So I hope you all have it within you to support allyship and other groups like this who put community first, no matter what. Because I know for me, being raised by activists and community like allyship really made a difference in how I showed up in the legislature. And it's made all the difference in what we've been able to do for our neighbors. So thank you again for having me. And I appreciate all the community here and what we're going to build together as we continue to fight for our rights, not only to hold the line, but to keep making progress that includes all of us.